Hola, soy Scoatl de Conversaciones en Casa y esta entrevista será en inglés porque tenemos a Judith Thorbergsson de Inglaterra para hablar sobre el medievo como parte de nuestros programas de historia de la música. So, hello Judy.
Hi.
How are you?
Yes, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Well.
Good.
So why don't you tell us a bit about what you do?
Here in Mexico. I'm a musician. I'm a professor at the Academia de Arte de Florencia. I trained as a pianist, organist, bassoonist, recorder player, harpsichordist, among various other weird and wonderful instruments. I worked as teacher, accompanist, performer, examiner. I lived in Iceland for many years until I decided to move to Mexico with my husband, and I've been here for just over 5 years.
Very, very interesting. What is the medieval like? What is it exactly?
Well, the medieval period is a period in history. Just to talk about periods in history a minute, it's interesting that history doesn't divide itself evenly into eras. As we get closer to modern times, then the rate of development happens exponentially. So the medieval period is actually a period of over 1200 years. So the medieval period is, we like to split it into three areas. We have the early Middle Ages or Dark Ages, which ends roughly with the fall of Rome. So this lasts from about the 5th century to the 11th century. Then we get the High Medieval era or the High Middle Ages, which is really the period of time which typifies the Middle Ages at its best, roughly until the 1300s. So by the end of the 11th century, at the end of the Dark Ages, most of Europe had become Christian. And it's within this period that we see an increase in what we call the intellectual renaissance, which is the establishment of universities. We see universities cropping up in London, Paris.
But it is well before the Renaissance, right? Like the one.
Yes, the Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about the intellectual Renaissance, it means the rebirth of intellectualism. So that we get the society looking back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome because of their cultural status, and a long time ago before that. And really by the end of the 13th century, Europe, which was really the center of culture in the world then, it was at its economic and cultural peak. So the thing about looking at history and the history of music is that the only way we have to decide what, or not to decide, but to look at what the music was like, what the history was like, is by the sources. We have really 7 different ways of tracing the history of music at those times. So these 7 ways are looking at original instruments, looking at art, looking at literary evidence, looking at the accounts of performers and performances. We have theoretical works and tutors. That's books which tell you how to do things, teaching manuals, if you like. Payment and inventories, and of course the music itself.
Mm-hmm. And so we're going to start with the instruments, right?
Yes, looking at the original instruments. So when we talk about, just to talk a little bit about evolution of instruments, evolution is maybe not the right word. Evolution represents the thought of survival of the fittest. The instruments themselves, they actually fulfilled the musical requirements of the day. But as society changed, taste changed, then the instruments developed to be able to play new types of music. Just to talk a bit about, compared to modern instruments, all of these instruments of the Middle Ages, or most of them, were the forefathers, if you like, or the predecessors to the instruments that we have today. Some of them became obsolete because they didn't fulfill the technical requirements and just fell out of use, or they just simply didn't work. And there was a lot of experimentation in the creation of instruments. What we have lost, though, today is the sounds that these instruments made were very much brighter, very different to the sounds that instruments make today. And it really wasn't until the middle of the 20th century, or 1970s even, that there was a sort of rebirth of interest, or renewal of interest in early music, and there was a lot of research done, and then we suddenly get to hear again the sounds of the Middle Ages that were simply non-existent.
And were there any instruments, like original instruments from the era that survived all this time?
Well, the instruments from before the year 1600 are very far and few between. The museums, you can find these instrument museums, but most of them have been restored because over such a long period of time, especially with the wind instruments, then they deteriorate and they need restoring. However, there are a few cases of original instruments in their original form, and I will go more in depth into that in our next interview.
Right.
But however, through the existence of folk music, which in many countries has preserved its medieval traditions, both of making instruments and playing, quite a number of those instruments live on virtually unchanged since the medieval. And they sort of provide a fascinating link with the live sounds of the past, because we don't really have any idea of the live sounds of the past. So this tradition of continuing the instruments through folk music gives us a better idea. There are instruments like the Arab lute, there's the fiddles of the Balkan, and shawms of Turkey and the Middle East. And we'll look in more detail into those instruments again in our next interview.
So that was very interesting. Do we know anything about how the music was from them? Is there any kind of sort of surviving music?
Yes, there is. Now, the printing press, for instance, we don't actually have printed music until the beginning of the printing press, which dates from 1465. Once the printing press arrived, then obviously we get a better idea of what music existed, music that was printed, for instance. But before then, all the music was handwritten. And obviously this is a very laborious, time-consuming task. And really the only people that did that were monks in monasteries to preserve what we call Gregorian chant, which I'll talk about later.
Right. Yeah. So I'll go to the next point. So how do we know about music from the art? What link does it have?
Okay. Well, medieval and Renaissance artists preserved a wealth of information about musicians and their instruments in many different forms, in carvings, statues, paintings, manuscript illustrations from monks, for instance, and woodcuts. Some of these are, though, very stylized by the artists and doesn't give us an exact or correct information about for instance, the size of the instrument, playing techniques, or exact construction details. But we do see a huge variety of instruments in the hands of angels in religious paintings from the 14th and 15th century. And anyone who's been to the Vatican, for instance, and had a look at the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel will see an array of instruments up there.
And so have I don't know, archaeologists or something, or someone reconstructed or constructed instruments based on that?
Yes, I mean the most of the instruments that we have today that represent the medieval instruments are from paintings, from all of these different types of things, but also from then more detailed information that I'll talk about later when we come to talk about tutors. Yes, I'll talk about that in that section.
Right. So that is very interesting. And how we mentioned a couple of minutes ago about writing. What kind of when did the musical writing start to exist?
Well, when I talk about literary evidence, I'm more talking about writings of poets. For instance, there are French pastoral poems mentioning shepherds and their pipes. There are writers like the British writer Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote, for instance, the Canterbury Tales, which is 24 stories, all mentioning music and musicians in various different ways, and that was in 1392. So there are many literary references to music and musicians over the ages.
So like the paintings have instruments being constructed based on that as well. The written descriptions of the instruments.
Well, the paintings were done by the actors. Obviously, the paintings in later years used literary descriptions in their art, but obviously the painters of the time, they had seen the instruments or heard them, and they included them. They thought that it was a connection to God as well. So that's why a lot of angels play instruments.
How interesting. And what do we know? What do we know about live performances, or what do we know about that?
Okay. So let's just think about the concept of concerts. In the Middle Ages, concerts as we know them today, they simply didn't exist. It wasn't until the rise of the bourgeois class, the middle classes, that the actual concept of concerts emerged. First concerts, just as a matter of interest, was not until London in 1672, given by violinists. And concerts were also in the 17th century given at the homes of the nobility in France and at the courts, obviously, in France. So for this reason, then we don't have a huge amount of eyewitness accounts, but they do exist. For instance, we have a text from what we call a minstrel. The minstrels were performers of instruments, and they traveled around country and they played to people at fairs and weddings and whatnot. And we have his medieval curriculum vitae, which says, "I tell you what I do. I'm a fiddler. I play the bagpipe and flute, harp, chiffony and giga, psaltery and rote, and I can sing a song as well." So there we have a very early curriculum vitae of someone who's hoping to get work somewhere. It was very common that musicians played more than one instrument. There's also a report of celebrations in London, in Westminster in 1306, where over 60 instrumentalists listed as taking part. And another report tells us of the Feast of the Pheasant, which was held in Lille in France in 1454, where there were featured a wide variety of colourful ensembles, including 28 musicians inside a huge pastry castle.
A pastry castle.
A pastry castle, so I guess they could eat their stage after they finished playing.
That's interesting. And what kind of people taught in music, or what kind of people learned music too? Was it reserved for some people, or was everyone free to learn music?
Well, a lot of music was self-taught, or you didn't find music schools until way later. Obviously, with the establishment of universities in the high Middle Age, then we start to see more learning go ahead, and also with the rise of the bourgeoisie in the 1600s, then a lot more people wanted to learn just for their own enjoyment. But up until then, it was a very specialized thing, and we do get some learning in Notre Dame in the 14th century. Also, the monks taught song to within the monasteries, because song was such a huge part of their worship.
Cuando llegamos al ascenso de este renacimiento medieval, por llamarlo de algún modo, había muchos teóricos que seguían prácticas o ideas griegas y estaban más preocupados con aspectos académicos o filosóficos más que musicales o los detalles prácticos. Así que no tenemos muchas referencias acerca de los instrumentos o la enseñanza, los métodos de enseñanza. El primer dato relevante que tenemos es de un tratado del año 1487 de Johannes Tintares. Tenemos mucha más información al llegar al siglo XVI. El primer verdadero tratado fue escrito por Sebastián Bildung en el 1511 y habla de los instrumentos de teclado, el laúd y la flauta. Unos años más tarde tenemos en los principios del siglo XVI, quizá uno de los más importantes documentos, un tratado de Michael Pretorius, un músico alemán y musicólogo, que creó una enciclopedia, Syntagma Musicum, que tiene 3 volúmenes. El segundo volumen trata acerca de los instrumentos de la época y también los que él conocía de épocas anteriores. Y el tercer volumen habla sobre la música de su época y las técnicas de enseñanza, incluidos técnicas del arco, todo tipo de temas relacionados. Otra cosa interesante sobre esta enciclopedia es que incluye grabados con ilustraciones que representan a los instrumentos desde una perspectiva tridimensional, y eso nos permite realmente saber cómo eran los instrumentos.
How
interesante. Y en algún momento ser músico se convirtió en un trabajo.
Did at some point being a musician become like a job or something?
Sí, tenemos a los trovadores y juglares, y la manera en que sabemos sobre esto son recibos de pagos e inventarios que se conservan de diferentes fuentes. Sin embargo, ser un músico en esa época no era un trabajo muy respetable.
No.
Puedes ver en los pagos que casi se equipara con los criminales.
Vagabonds and rogues, or criminals, if you like. So they weren't highly respected.
Lo que es interesante es una lista de inventarios de la corte real y de la nobleza que usaban muchos recursos, muchos instrumentos para su entretenimiento. Muchos de los compositores que conocemos hoy en día trabajaban para la corte, producían su música por encargo para la corte. Algunos de los más famosos, por ejemplo, Bach, aunque no él es de otro periodo, pero esta práctica comenzó en la Edad Media y continuó hasta bien entrado el Barroco. Uno de los inventarios más interesantes es de la corte de Enrique VIII, rey de Inglaterra, que fue rey entre los años de 1491 y 1547. Él tenía una gran cantidad de instrumentos. Se menciona en su inventario gaitas, clavicordios, 18 cronornos, cornetas, dulcemías, flautas, chirimías, incluyendo 3 flautas de vidrio, organillos, harpsicordios, uno que tenía una rueda que explicaré después, que es el hurdy-gurdy, las virginales, laúdes, 3 órganos, bastones de peregrino, flautas de pico, liras de arco, taberde y violas. Son muchos instrumentos.
Es cierto.
Si quieren saber lo que es el cromorno, tengo aquí un ejemplo.
¿En serio?
Sí, es un instrumento muy interesante. Parece como un bastón y de hecho es un instrumento de aliento. Aquí tiene una tapita y cuando lo abrimos encontramos una caña doble. Las cañas dobles son como las que se usan para tocar el saxofón, para quienes no
¿Y esa caña era así? Porque parece
was that reed always like that, or because that is a pretty modern reed, I understand.
Sí, es una caña doble, son 2 juntas. Es como la del saxofón y la del clarinete, pero esta está hecha de plástico. No lo voy a tocar en este momento, los mostraré después. Una familia de instrumentos, el soprano,
like saxophones. Is that linked to the saxophone? Like, is that a predecessor?
El tenor y el bajo. Sí, sí podríamos decir que está familiarizada con el saxofón, pero muy lejanamente. Como pueden ver, esta caña está en un pequeño tubito metálico. Y produce un sonido muy como metálico, es muy interesante.
Oh, wrong hat.
Entonces soplamos en la tapa y eso hace que la caña vibre, produce el sonido. Preparé una pequeña canción para ustedes. Escrita por William Byrd.
Who was around in the 1500s.
That's beautiful. That's very interesting.
Con esto
sounding.
llegamos a nuestro último punto de hoy. La música en sí. ¿Qué música tenemos? Porque supongo que no podemos saber mucho de música que no está escrita. ¿Cuándo comenzó la notación musical?
We just heard, but what music do we have? When did because I guess we can't know about music that isn't written. So when did writing music came?
Sí, antes de la llegada de la imprenta, solo había música escrita a mano. Sin la posibilidad de tener música escrita, la tradición era simplemente memorizarlo de oído y había mucha improvisación. Los compositores compusieron o escribieron para el presente, no para la posteridad. No estaban pensando en que su música fuera para después. Los músicos tenían un estrecho, digamos, variedad de estilos. No había como tal piezas con instrumentación específica, casi no. Se tocaban en cualquier instrumento que estuviera disponible en el momento. Solo había un extenso repertorio para el teclado, los laúdes y otros precedentes del violín, que es la familia de la viola. Los tempranos repertorios para músicos escribían en tablatura, similar al que usa la guitarra. La única música, digamos, tal cual que se ha permanecido de la Edad Media, son músicas de una sola melodía. Música de baile, no músicas para varios instrumentos al mismo tiempo. Había muchas tipos, Stampis, Salterielli. El principal rol de los instrumentos era acompañar la música. Esta música se usaba solo para fines no religiosos, sino seculares. Existían baladas, virelais, rondos, la ronda, otras músicas, otras formas musicales. One of the how would you say otra de las características de la música medieval es que está restringida en su tipo de compases. El rango musical era muy pequeño, entonces había una limitación en cuanto a ello. Muchos de los instrumentos solo tenían una sola voz. El trombone que acabo de mostrar es una excepción porque sí tenía sus diferentes voces. No había familias de instrumentos.
It wasn't families of instruments, just one.
Obviously, we get families of instruments, exactly the same families that we have today. But because of the restrictions in the range of
porque había
music,
restricciones sobre quién pudiera cantar, entonces no había voces sopranos, no eran necesarias. Pero cuando escuchas música como ensamble de la Edad Media, puedes ver contrastes en diferentes instrumentos, como algunos de los ejemplos que vamos a escuchar. Ha sido muy interesante. Es la primera parte de la Edad Media porque son 1200 años, entonces es muy amplio. Vamos a escuchar algunos ejemplos de música en el siguiente programa. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego. Gracias, hasta luego.
And goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.